begin with this topic, it's kind of worth thinking about and just reminding ourselves what happened to AIDS funding since the late 1980s up until now. And you can see from that graph, it was in the doldrums for almost all of the 1990s, starting to pick up soon after UNAIDS was set up, but only slightly. But it took a whole lot of political interventions at the international level before the international, this is funding from all sources, but international funding from the donor side for AIDS. So it really was as these big political changes happened with the United Nations General Assembly Special Session on AIDS, the Abuja Declaration of African Leaders, and then the 3x5 declaration, let's put 3 million people on treatment by 2005, PEPFAR, the G8 commitment to universal access, the Global Fund, and suddenly it starts taking off from 2001 to 3, steeply up to about 2007, and then it's dropped off. Now the problem is now. What do we do now, given that that's our background? The little red line at the top there is, of course, what we need. So UNAIDS, certainly through from the late 1990s all the way into the 2000s, was making these arguments quite well. If we really are going to try and address treatment and prevention needs, we need to get X amount of money. And very steeply, we were trying to catch up with that. But even at the height of the catching up, we are a lot short of where we should be, as opposed to when UNAIDS was estimating that from about 2009 onwards. Now, a couple of points about this graph. What was happening in the 2000s on the economic side? That was the biggest economic boom that the world's had, certainly since the Second World War, if not ever. It's a very long, very powerful economic boom that came to a crashing end in October 2008. So that gave the impetus for the money. But that wasn't the only reason why we had this growth in funding. There was a big ideological shift as well. Clinicians, AIDS activists were fighting to put AIDS on the agenda, and they were able to do it because there were the resources to back them. So we've got to think about that too. So underpinning this was the discourse of AIDS exceptionality. And this is something that UNAIDS started, was again eventually picked up by the WHO, and it kind of took off with UNGAS. By the time that the United Nations were beginning to think that AIDS was a threat to human security, that's at that point, the discourse of AIDS exceptionality was at its most powerful politically. And here's a nice quote from Stephen Lewis, who is, of course, Kofi Annan's special envoy for AIDS in Africa between 2001 and 2006. It's a nice quote from him. And this is from 2009. AIDS is exceptional. I tramped the high prevalence countries of Africa for more than 5 years. If it wasn't viewing the most exceptional communicable disease assault of the 20th century, then the word exceptional needs to be redefined. As a consequence of that exceptionality and the tremendous campaigning of grassroots advocates, AIDS received funding, a lot of funding, never enough to be sure, but enough to recognize the exceptionality. So he's also putting this discursive shift, this politically powerful argument as being one of the reasons that we saw this huge increase in funding. And it is relevant to what do we do now that that discourse is being challenged, and of course so is the economic growth. Okay, so that's his point that Stephen Lewis was making. We had the economic growth, we had the UN responding to arguments mobilized through UNAIDS about exceptionality, but underpinning all of that was, of course, AIDS activism. Incredibly important. And Peter Piot with UNAIDS was very far-sighted to put AIDS activists onto his board and bring them right into the center. So it became almost a Trojan horse in the middle of the UN family, which actually put these activists that were very powerful on the streets into the center of AIDS decision-making, and all these arguments about nothing about us without us, greater involvement of people with AIDS, all of that came through this initiative. So it was this domestic and international AIDS activism. They managed to win all sorts of arguments, but the one that really helped when we think about how all of this translated into the support for antiretroviral treatment, the big argument they made in 2 stages was that treatment is a form of prevention. And first of all, they were saying, well, you've got to address stigma, and if you don't actually give people the option of getting onto treatment, you know the argument, they're not going to get tested. That was the first leg of it. And then as we got more science on the subject, roundabout, you know, the viral load goes down when you're on ARVs, etc. And then all that modeling that we saw about how perhaps you could even test and then treat everybody, you could kill the epidemic. All of that was a sort of a latter version of the same argument, which was another powerful impetus for pushing money into antiretroviral treatment. Because certainly up until, 2003 was this major change, because certainly up until then, and when I wrote the book that Francois was talking about, it was just a completely absurd idea that you should have treatment programs, particularly in developing countries. It was, no, we just can't afford that. You know, prevention only. So we were on an uphill struggle in the early 2000s, and then there was just this complete shift in favor of, no, this is good evidence-based medicine for prevention and treatment, and that came up. So that was their argument about treatment versus prevention. That is now also, unfortunately, getting under attack as well. So a lot of these ingredients that were underpinning our rollout here are under threat of some kind. Okay, so this is what's happened. I'm sure these numbers are second nature to you, but it's always useful to see how steep that change was and how incredibly unprecedented this is. We have never had a disease where the donor community has turned around to this extent, and particularly for something like antiretroviral treatment. So that is, with the red line is, of course, the red bar is people on heart, and the red bar is people on heart in sub-Saharan Africa. So that went very, very sharply up from 2003, and that's the start of that the 3x5 campaign. But notice this quote on the side, which was in the newspaper in this month, in fact, 2 weeks ago, by Paul DeLay, who's the Deputy Executive Director of UNAIDS. We are seriously concerned about the future of HIV treatment programs. Only about a third of people in need have access to treatment. In the current economic climate, even sustaining that over the long term will be a challenge. So, they really are signaling that this is probably as high as we're going to go, unless we change the way we roll out treatment. UNAIDS talks about, I don't know if you saw the last report about treatment 2.0, which is a kind of a wish list of, well, maybe we can have these even cheaper and more effective single pills, and maybe we can get these CD4 counts that you can, interventions that you can run in rural areas. Maybe we can keep growing with limited resources. But that kind of initiative is what we're going to need if we're not going to actually hit a ceiling on the numbers of people. So at the moment, we've got 5.2 million on treatment globally, and that's where it's gone from. So I'm going to talk a bit more about the funding. In addition to running the AIDS and Society Research Unit, I'm also in the economics department. So I initially came into this topic pretty much on the side of numbers and what are the stories about affordability. So where does the money go? All right, so that top graph is something we know, that the highest prevalence countries are in sub-Saharan Africa. So that Africa, that's got 4% of the world's population, has 2/3 of the world's HIV positive people. So you can see it's very much an African focus, that the international donor community is throwing money mostly at Africa, though also in other parts of the world. But it's predominantly in this part of the world, and predominantly down in southern Africa. And I'll show you some pictures. And it's also important to bear in mind not just the prevalence rates, right, the percentage that are positive, but the actual numbers. If you just put the actual numbers of HIV positive people on this graph, you can see this veritable Manhattan, with South Africa being by far the greatest number of people, the country with the greatest number of HIV positive people in the world. And then right next to down there is Nigeria, Mozambique, Kenya, Tanzania, India, and then actually the USA. So it's not accidental that that's USA 1.2. It's not accidental that they are the biggest funder of the global money for AIDS. I'll show you a picture of that too. But they're also actually a country which has got quite a lot of HIV positive people in it. And of course, the country that supported the AIDS activism, and the country that generated, in many respects, the great boom that we had and caused the crisis, of course, but never mind. So the money goes straight to Southern Africa mostly and low-income countries. So this is a slide that I've stolen from a presentation. It was by a person in UNAIDS, their UNAIDS economist. Don't think he's published it anywhere, but I'm part of the UNAIDS, WHO's economics reference group, and you get these cool slides. And it's quite an interesting slide because it's also showing you the way in which UNAIDS might be thinking about what to do in this crisis. So the size of these bubbles is how much money. And then where the bubble is, it's kind of located in this space where this is HIV spending as a percentage of your gross national income. So that's Botswana. It spends quite a lot, 2.5% of its gross national income on HIV spending. And there's quite a lot. This is domestic spending by these countries. And then down here is aid dependency as a percentage of HIV spending. How much of their spending is aid and how much of it's domestic? So the middle-income countries, as you would imagine, are the ones that are spending, the ones that are HIV affected, are spending the most. So we've got Brazil, that's Brazil. South Africa, Thailand, Botswana, that's Tanzania and Zimbabwe up there. So, and obviously, as you get more on towards the aid dependency, the amount of money that the countries spend themselves shrinks relative to that. But these are the big countries here on the domestic spending. Where's international money spent? Okay, now this makes a lot of sense. The international money is going, obviously, where there's much more aid dependency along that bottom axis, and it's the poorer countries that get most of the spending. So we've got Rwanda, Uganda, Haiti, Tanzania, and Zimbabwe, and South Africa. Now, remember, South Africa and Botswana are spending a lot of their own resources, but they're also getting a lot of international resources, and that is, of course, in reaction to the fact that they've got the most HIV-positive people. Now, I just want to comment a bit about these slides that they came out of UNAIDS. UNAIDS is beginning to look at countries and ask the question, are they contributing enough? Basically, let's see if we go back to that. Surely, this is not domestic. Surely the countries should be spending at least 1% of their their income themselves. And they're beginning to sort of say, well, you might have the most people, but if you should be kind of up there more like Botswana. So there's much more pressure now coming from the UN body that countries must come more to the table. And in a way, that's a failure of the Abuja Declaration, which was African presidents getting together and saying they were going to spend 5% of their resources, the budgets on health, and they haven't done that. So there's definitely the fact that we've got these axes coming out of UNAIDS is beginning to say, look, we'll help more from your domestic side, which of course is difficult politically for countries. Now they've got to fight a domestic battle over resources. Should it go to education or health? It's going to come to it's not just going to be an international argument about donor resource. It's going to be much more, for all of these countries, political battles at the level of the country. All right, that's the international one. Here's the other big fact to take home about where does this donor assistance, about the thing about donor money. Most of it comes to the US. So what the US does is completely crucial. Nearly 60%, 58% of international assistance is coming from the US. So you've got to really watch what Obama is doing, and which is why the AIDS activists are, what they call it, bird dogging him, running around during the election campaign with posters saying, keep the promise, pushing, because what happens in the US really does affect what happens in our part of the world hugely. So it has increased its commitment to the Global Fund by nearly 40%, which is great, actually. Obama is trying to push money into AIDS, and PEPFAR funding has grown marginally. Less than he had promised. But, I sort of have an argument with the AIDS activists in America. I say to them, you're lucky it hasn't gone down. Because when he promised that, the economy was still booming. It wasn't, there's a political difficulty that's facing the Democrats right now on this. And we can talk more about that later. How much can we expect? Okay, so this is what we've got. From 2008, the donor funding has leveled off, partly in response to the global economic crisis, but also because of the growing backlash against AIDS funding. So 2 diagrams here. The one on the right with the red bars, that's total disbursements from the donor side. Look how they jump from 2007 to 2008, and then they basically stop, 2009. And over here, flatlined, this is PEPFAR. And that's PEPFAR all the way to 2011. And it's rising slightly, but it's again not as much, but it's also flatlining. But I still think that's quite a victory, that we've still got PEPFAR money coming in, particularly as Obama is also putting money into the Global Fund. So America is still quite committed to AIDS, which is important. So is the backlash, which I'm going to talk about. The backlash is a set of claims about should we be putting money into HIV, actually, rather than anything else, and secondly, should we be putting it into antiretroviral therapy? There's going to be this kind of double-edged aspect to the backlash. And you can't, to say that it's all just the economic climate is to miss the fact that the backlash started before. It actually started in 2007, really before the financial crisis, and in the face of that big jump. So it was kind of as people saw that extra resources were being pushed in, that there was a huge fast rollout, people in other parts of the development community started saying, hey, you can get more bang for your buck if you fix the water systems or fix the roads. You know the argument, more money to education rather than throwing it at treatment programs where people just die. That story was beginning to be seen in 2007, and it really gained momentum in 2008 and 9. So just to stick on this question of America. So that's America. The red line is the share of all resources for AIDS. It's more than a quarter of its money is going on to that. And it's the blue is the share of the world GDP. So it's got the most GDP, and it's also putting more money into AIDS compared to these other countries. But that's not the way that the American activists look at it. They rather look at this, which is to say, what is America spending per dollar of its GDP? And you can see US is right down here. So although it's spending the most money on AIDS, it's also by far the biggest country. And so the AIDS activists are saying, you're not really spending your fair share. So that's the other reason they're pushing. And these other countries, Denmark, Netherlands, Sweden, the UK, are actually giving us more in relation to their capacity to give us money. So that's kind of interesting about US, but it's also interesting as to why. Why should these different countries, when they think about AIDS, be so different about how much money they're prepared to give? And that is, to me, is a reflection of the fact that sometimes the AIDS argument, the argument in favor of AIDS exceptionality, works in some countries and not others, and in some political contexts and not others. And we've got to be quite wary. You don't just win the argument and then you've won it. It resonates differently across the world, and it's constantly fluctuating. And I think that picture sort of says a lot. Why is Canada really not coming to the party? Or Japan really? Australia, France. Yet, Ireland is right out there. And that's because of the way in which advocates in those countries are making the arguments. So politics and discourse really matters here. All right, so get back to Stephen Lewis. He's talking about the backlash. And again, this is from 2009. He's a great guy for rhetoric. After he got all of the money being pushed up into this unprecedented increase in money, he says, then along came the detractors, driven by resentment at the success of the AIDS movement. And in some respects, that's true. They really were quite resentful of them. These arithmetic arguments alleging that AIDS is getting too much money at the expense of other health imperatives. This is simply naked academic and bureaucratic envy, the seething resentment that pulsates beneath the surface to create this false argument. I mean, he's kind of not entirely wrong, but you've kind of got to do better than this anyway to really convince people. But in this speech, he called on scientists in the AIDS community to resist this punitive spasm to ransack resources for AIDS and to find a way collectively to shoot down the pinched bureaucrats and publicity-seeking academics who advocate exchanging the health of some for the health of others. And that he could have easily said economists there, because there certainly are quite a few in my profession that were arguing precisely that. And the argument coming out of economics was, if we had to sit down rationally and figure out where should we put our money, Should we be putting it in treatment programs, or should we be putting it in anti-diarrheal interventions? For example, the classic ones, vaccinations. Obviously, it obviously makes sense to move money in that direction. It's just obviously the case. And that's been that way for a hell of a long time. So they've reinvented this argument. They've come and said, we could, in a perfect world, move the money and save more lives. And my argument against that, which I'll pick up at the end of this talk, is, but we're not in a perfect world. And you've got to understand what was the politics behind the AIDS response. And if you take it away, are you going to get the political forces behind all these other hypothetically good things that you could do? Or is the money just going to get wasted in bureaucratic and government wage salaries and fast cars for ministers? That, there's no guarantee that the perfect world that the economists can imagine actually turns up in the real world. So there's a politics about that too. All right, so when did the backlash start? Pretty much the International Health Partnership from some 2007, before the crisis. And that really was the first time that we saw people getting up and saying on serious international stages that the Millennium Development Goals 4 and 5, which are 4 is to reduce child mortality and 5 is to improve maternal health, have been sort of neglected in favor of AIDS. MDG 6, the Millennium Development Goal 6, which is combat HIV, malaria, and other diseases. So that was the first time that kind of juxtaposition occurred. Then this was taken further by the Task Force for Innovative Financing for Health Systems, which was chaired by Gordon Brown, remember the ex-head of the UK, and Zulik from the World Bank. And they just took it for granted, like it was a stylized fact out there that the Millennium Development Goals 4 and 5 had been neglected. And they put up a kind of a special task force, and they didn't even invite the Global Fund onto it, which is really interesting. I mean, there was quite a lot of hostility at this point towards what they were seeing at this stage as this huge jump in AIDS funding. And notice this is now after that big jump from 2007 to 2008. Oxfam and DFID jumped on the same bandwagon. They had a moratorium on new health initiatives. And the US started to signal, too, that it would cut AIDS spending, but actually hasn't succeeded. And that's partly because there's been a lot of political support still within the US to stop the US from doing that. But they were beginning to signal in 2008 that's what they were going to do. So I want to look at some of these numbers and a couple of these claims. And this is the most important one, that AIDS spending is disproportionate to the disease burden. This is the main backlash claim. They say, well, let's have a look at the disability-adjusted life years lost due to AIDS, that's a measure of the burden of disease, as a share of total disability-adjusted life years lost from all diseases. That's your AIDS burden. That's the share of AIDS in total disease burden along that axis. On the vertical axis is the AIDS spending. This is domestic and international as a percentage of total health spending. So this was the big claim. Too much money has gone into AIDS relative to what the share of AIDS in the disease burden. So I looked at this. I did some work. This is my figure here with Greg Gonzalez, who is an AIDS activist from America. He spent some time in South Africa. And he and I did some work together in America on this. And we put together this data set and looked at the relationship. So if you were to spend exactly, your share of AIDS spending as a percentage of total health spending as your share of AIDS in the disease burden, you'd be on this 45-degree line. Right? So there are a couple of countries that are exactly on it. Any country that's above the line is actually spending more on AIDS, right, than you would expect if you were trying to spend equally on all your diseases, right? Get that? So Uganda is above the line. Tanzania is above the line. Rwanda is above the line. Haiti, Eritrea, right? Madagascar. But there's a lot of countries below the line, including South Africa. Look where South Africa is. Huge AIDS in the disease burden, and we're way below that line. And this kind of line here is a sort of regression line. It's an average. So we then basically made the argument that Actually, most countries overall, in fact, are below the line. The regression line is not at 45 degrees, it's like this. And anyway, look at the big countries in Southern Africa, which has got all those people. So the Malawi, Mozambique, Namibia, Swaziland, Botswana, Lesotho, South Africa, all below. That was the claim we made. Now, the big proponent of the backlash is a man called Mead Over. He's an economist in Washington. And we published this in Science in a kind of a debate on the letters page with Mead Over. And his response to this graph was to say, well, you know, that's UNAIDS data that we're using. And if you use a different data set, if you look at data from the OECD, sometimes the countries are out of whack. So it's not really clear that this would actually work if you use a different set of data. That was his kind of response to it. Another argument against this is to say, look, you're using data from 2007. That was the most available, that was the best data we could find. And 2007 is a problem because there was a big jump to 2008. So I'm much more concerned about that second argument. To me, I'm not sure this picture still holds on that. So I have a student right now, and I'm going to show you some of his results, that's been sitting there knocking his head on these different data sources, using the 2008 data from different sources and trying to put it all together to see what the story is. So there's UNAIDS data. UNAIDS collects data on all of this spending from the different countries. The OECD gets data from the donors. So it's a donor side. They don't have very good data on governments. And then there's a couple of other sources where you can get flows to NGOs. And he's been trying to put all of this together and see what the story is. And this is him showing what is the difference between the OECD data and UNAIDS data. So, for example, if it's above the line, it means that in the case of Nigeria, right, there's one of those countries with lots of HIV-positive people, the OECD data is, in fact, says that there's much more AIDS spending than UNAIDS says. So if the more countries were like Nigeria, then my graph would be wrong. But there's a whole lot of countries that are, in fact, like Rwanda, where the OECD data actually suggests that UNAIDS is overestimating the money. So I look at that and I think, actually, it cancels out. Although for some countries it might be material. So you need to look at particular countries. Now, this is the work in progress by my student, Matthew McDevitt, out of his master's. And he's taken the top 20 countries with the number for people living with HIV, and he's looked at exactly the same exercise that I did, but this time for 2008 and for different data sources. And he's finding it's actually switched over. That now we've got 14 countries out of the 20 that are spending more on AIDS than the share of the disease burden, and only 6 are underspending. Now, there's a couple of problems with this. He hasn't got Swaziland in this story. There's a couple of missing countries, but I think the point is what you'd expect. That big jump from 2000 to 2008 probably changed the global picture. So I think there is going to be a backlash that's real in the UN on general spending for AIDS. The good news for us is that South Africa is still, no matter how you cut the numbers, seriously below. So South Africa shouldn't fall, but a lot of other Southern African countries are going to be experiencing, I think, a cut in funding if donors use this kind of measure. So they are going to have a much stronger political problem. So Nigeria, according to this, is overspending. So who are the ones that are underspending? South Africa, India, Thailand, Cameroon, Ghana, and Brazil. So it's I'm much less certain that one can go out and say, on average, countries are we still need more money globally for AIDS. It's beginning to look like some countries need support more than others, and the global coalition in support of AIDS funding is probably going to find itself fracturing. It's not going to be so easy to be punting for AIDS money. Anyway, that's just work in progress. But there's nothing stops South Africa from being very clearly in need of more money, domestically and internationally. Right, what's the backlash claim number 2? The rise in AIDS spending has been at the cost of health spending elsewhere. You've heard that, I'm sure. And there's anecdotal evidence for this. Malawi, you know, that was right in the early rollout. People went in there and got nurses from the public sector, and there were lots of complaints. That was all changed later. And the donors made a much greater effort to put synergies between the public sector and the AIDS rollout. There's some work by economists on foreign aid for health resulting in crowding out domestically. Now, what that means is they go and do these calculations that before a whole lot of donor money went to this country, they were spending this much on health, right? And now actually they are putting in less resources because you've given them resources and they've taken the difference and put it into education. But this is kind of what you would expect. And there's been two answers to that. Well, it hasn't been so much, and it hasn't been that much on health. And anyway, they've been putting it into good things, like education. So should we really worry about it? So there's been a bit of a debate about that, and that argument hasn't really held up. But to some extent, donors don't like this. They don't like the idea that if you go and give a poor country money to add to its health budget, they're going to take some money and stick it into something else. So this is what's quite interesting about this debt to health program of the Global Fund. The Global Fund goes to countries and says, you've got the donors. There's a couple of countries here that have got an HIV problem and they owe you debt. How about you cancel that debt on condition that the country takes the money you're cancelling and adds it to their health budget, and we'll monitor that. And that really works. I mean, Germany really likes this and has been participating in this. So in some countries politically that resonates because they worry about this kind of problem of what they call fungibility. Then there's that old one here, backlash claim number 3, the vertical AIDS programs have undermined health systems efficacy. And again, there's some anecdotal evidence for that. And there was this great big study that was hosted and then published in The Lancet, having all sorts of development practitioners and clinicians and activists. And they sort of came to a conclusion that, yeah, there were some cases where this happened, but there are lots of cases that they didn't, and that there's lots we can learn and we can be more synergistic. That's where that whole debate ended up. The other thing about vertical programs is everyone accepts that they're not optimal. Right, these are the standalone programs rather than integrated into the existing health system. But they can build momentum in the initial stages. We saw that in Khayelitsha. Also, if you shift from vertical programs into sector-wide or integrated health systems approaches, when your institutions are weak, you could really just destroy the program. And we've learned, and I'm going to talk about this again, the Zambian TB program collapsed in the 1990s when they did that. We can't have a standalone TB program. Let's just integrate it. Suddenly, no TB treatment for like 3 years because the system couldn't actually deal with it. So that's the other problem with this kind of simple vertical and horizontal type debate. So there's Stephen Lewis again pointing out that actually, if you had to think about horizontal and vertical, he points out very well here in this quote that the AIDS movement and, in fact, all the money coming into AIDS, and by focusing on prevention and treatment, you effectively integrated all sorts of systems, educational, health, across a wide range of society, and that this was probably the most integrated and horizontal movement ever. Right, and then backlash claim number 4 is let's prioritize HIV prevention, radically cut back on AIDS treatment. Now, this is the one that's worrying me, because this claim has coming back to life. It's a bit like a sort of, yeah, somebody's been bitten by a vampire. It's just, it really is coming back to life, because what we managed to kill that argument initially by pointing out that you needed to have HIV treatment in order to have prevention, and also that you needed to roll out treatment in order to get mother-to-child transmission prevention and to reduce AIDS mortality. So I'm just on this diagram I've got up here, I hope you can see it at the back, but that's South African data. The little line here, the one at the bottom, is the bottom of the graph, is infant mortality in Khayelitsha dropping from 2000, from 43, right, in 2001 down to 31, whereas if you use the ASA model to project what would have happened in the absence of treatment, that's the top green line, it would have still been, very high and not dropping. And then the blue line is if you had mother-to-child transmission prevention, you'd drop a lot, down to 48, that's the blue line. But if you run mother-to-child transmission prevention and antiretroviral therapy, you get the same drop. This is from the ASA model. That's their prediction. That model predicted that would cause the drop because you're saving lives of adults as well as children, and you are preventing new HIV infections, all of that. And in fact, that does mirror the drop in infant mortality. So that argument, I think, was won. However, recent studies in the US and Holland are suggesting that the drop in HIV incidence following the hard rollout is caused mainly by HIV prevention programs and not, as the ASA model assumes, that people are less infectious on ARVs. So this is still now a debate because there are some studies that show, yes, the viral loads go down, and this is probably related to the drop in background HIV infections. But now there's an argument coming through saying, actually, you can't really separate the impact of the biology of the lower HIV, of the lower viral load from the fact that these programs came in with HIV prevention messages. And most worryingly is the fact that increasing levels of data showing that people are still infectious in the first 6 months. So if we are going to keep making this argument, which I think is really important, the pressures on HIV clinicians to make sure that we can, in fact, keep people suppressed on the viral load, that this is going to get picked up in studies, because it's the donors in Washington that are reading these studies. Then there's the obvious backlash claim that, I won't spend much on this, that AIDS activists are just self-interested and have distorted spending away. So the message for AIDS activists is that they've got to keep working to push for general health system support. They mustn't ever be seen to be just pushing for AIDS treatment against the rest of society, because this argument just lurks politically. It's very dangerous. And AIDS activists have managed to survive this argument because they have genuinely been pushing for health systems reform. They've been building better health systems. They've been pushing for TB treatment. So people don't see them as self-interested. But if they start fighting for resources in a contracting economy, they run that danger, and then you could get a political backlash domestically, particularly in the other Southern African countries. But anyways, I think it's a bad argument, this backlash claim. I think the activists have been tremendous, and they've been the best thing we've had actually building health systems, let alone HIV. And this is a quote from Johnny Steinberg's wonderful book, Caesar's Test, or the Three-Letter Plague. You know, he's talking about, he's reflecting on the treatment program in Lusiki and Khayelitsha. And he says, the idea of demanding that a drug be put on a shelf or that a doctor arrive at his appointed time is without precedent. The social movement to which AIDS medicine has given birth is utterly novel in this part of the world. The relationship between its members and state institutions previously unheard of. And that's the point. It's changing the way that citizens deal with the state. But then if we're going to keep this up, we've got to keep that going. And I don't know what the answer is to that. And my concern as a political economist is that's what's wrong with that economic argument. You've got to go with where have we been successful at mobilizing resources, and it's AIDS. You've got to actually use AIDS to then build into the health systems and then win popular support and the political support to keep fighting AIDS and to fight for the health system. I don't know how to do that, but that's what we've really got to do. So this is my key challenges. Support and build heart patient organizations to help reduce loss to follow-up. And my last two slides are coming up. It's going to be on that issue. To make the political case for heart, to put pressure on governments to improve health systems. Then we've got to back UN AIDS. And again, that's got to be done at various levels. Develop easier, cheaper, and more effective heart regimens. There's Treatment 2.0. The Clinton Foundation's been doing really good work on that. And we've got to really worry about these new recent free trade agreements, particularly between India and the EU, which looks like it's putting an end to the cheap and the generics that we've been getting out of India. And I think that probably as clinicians, we should really be pushing on that all over the world, because that's one way in which you're not asking for more resources. You're just actually arguing for different dispensations around intellectual property rights. And I actually think we've got to keep developing HIV science. I really think to push for a cure is necessary. I think the great dream that antiretrovirals, and particularly the test and treat idea as being a way of combating the epidemic, that's pretty much not working. And so we need more basic science. An argument from the United States which was published in PLOS Medicine a couple of weeks ago, in fact, which showed that actually very few people that need to be on care in the United States are in care. That they've got about 1.2 million people with HIV, and they go down the graph showing that actually most of those people don't even know they're HIV positive, and of those that have been tested, only 80% of those are in care. Of those that need to be on antiretroviral treatment, it's about 350,000. It's just about 250,000. And of those that are in treatment, actually a whole lot of about 20% of their viral loads are not in zero. And so the argument coming out of this article is that we've failed in the United States to get people to respond well to antiretroviral treatment. Now that worries me, because that's very quickly people are going to say in the United States, well, we've wasted your money. All of this program on HIV prevention treatment's going out the window if people aren't on treatment and they're not actually taking it seriously. So there's been a similar study in 2008 which looked at 5 treatment programs in Africa, which also showed very strong loss to follow-up. I'm sure you've seen that, where the numbers went from 5% to about 50% loss to follow-up across these places, with very large numbers of people expected to be dead on those treatment programs. And again, those studies are beginning to gain momentum, and they're going to appear in the corridors of Washington, and the economists are going to be saying, well, look, the activists told us, we roll out treatment, we're going to save these lives. Actually, people are just disappearing off the programs in unacceptably high numbers. We're not succeeding. So I don't quite know what we need to do there, but clinicians have to worry about loss to follow-up, and it might be better to try and put more resources into keeping those people that we put on treatment than to try and expand it so that and then we just lose more people. I'm not sure what the answer is, but I worry that that's going to feed straight back into the backlash against AIDS as being something we can't do anything about, that we never should have put all that money into AIDS treatment. So, and I think that there's a lot of policymakers in Washington that are looking for precisely that argument. They're looking for some excuse to move money away from AIDS, and we really mustn't give it to them. So let's have a discussion about that.